Well, that tees us up for a conversation, this show, doesn't it? We've got Dr. Steve Nolan with us as well, who's senior lecturer in economics at Liverpool's John Moores University. His research interests include political economy. Steve, very good morning.
Hi, Sean.
So that point Rachel makes there, that many may well be feeling themselves when they see headlines of another Prime Minister under pressure. But yet, when the nation went to the polls last week, there was very much a signal that many weren't happy with how things are going at the minute. Is there a culture of instability?
I mean, it's hard to argue that there's not, really. And I think, you almost don't need me to kind of expand on it. I think Rachel kind of highlighted so many of the issues there. The almost kind of like normal economic term, the opportunity cost that was happening whilst we're always talking about kind of the personalities or the kind of the skills or demerits of the people in charge, is the policy work that's either not getting done or is getting disrupted.
But where is that culture then, Steve, of instability? Is it just amongst MPs? Is it amongst us as a nation, how we vote? Because when we have an election like we've had, and so many make their point to say we're not backing the current situation, is that instability, or is that just the leaders and the government of the day not actually doing what people want them to be doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a strong argument to make that the Prime Minister's not doing the job of Prime Minister. And part of that is almost kind of a rhetorical job of kind of selling the position of what they've been doing. It's hard. There are some achievements that this government has made, but clearly they're not coming through. But I think there is something kind of deeper and kind of structural, or something that's changed in terms of how the electorate relates to politicians. You see the stat that I can't remember who made it yesterday, that almost like the last 3 to 4 prime ministers at some point have been the most unpopular on record. I think we have got some kind of into a negative equilibrium of our kind of attitude towards politicians.
The election results last week were tough, very tough. We lost some brilliant Labour representatives. That hurts. And it should hurt. I get it. I feel it. And I take responsibility. I also take responsibility for delivering the change that we promised, for a stronger and fairer Britain that we must build. And I take responsibility for not walking away.
So, Dr. Steve Nolan, senior lecturer in economics, you look at political economy. What did you make of that speech?
I generally, it didn't feel like it met the moment as much as it could have done. I mean, there was a few statements in there. One about kind of nationalising British Steel. I know you're going to talk about that later on. One about closer movement to Europe. But again, it was at the kind of level of rhetoric rather than of policy. And clearly, it didn't meet what his MPs' expectations would have been at this time.
Let's talk a little bit. We will get into the British Steel story in a bit more depth later in the programme. But just in terms of, tell us what that represents, do you think? The fact that we heard about that yesterday, that the Prime Minister has announced that the Chinese-owned company, British Steel, so when we say British Steel, we're not talking about the entire sector as we might once have done. There's a company called British Steel. It's Chinese-owned. It's had financial problems for many years now. But there was an announcement that it's going to be brought into public ownership. Did that have something to do with the political problems the Prime Minister is having at the moment?
Well, in terms of the announcement, it's kind of, I think it is pressing a kind of a sweet spot for Labour politicians, especially those of the more soft left, of being a bit more interventionist in the economy. But at the level of policy, I mean, it's not really substantively changing where it was. There's like that British Steel, to all intents and purposes, had been nationalised last year. So it's kind of basically I think it was an attempt to signal to those that are concerned that this government hasn't met the promises in terms of its kind of stance on politics, of it being more kind of, for want of a better word, left wing than previous kind of governments, Labour governments for the last kind of 20, 30 years have been. But again, combine that with kind of nice words about Europe, but no kind of signalling of a kind of significant change in the red lines in terms of the customs union or the single market.
When you say nice words, you mean moving closer, being closer to the European Union.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we'll cuddle up, but it's not going to be any kind of substantive policy change. And I think at heart, there's still, actually kind of a reasonable position there. Is like, how much can this administration change given the stance it had in its manifesto on the election? It was fairly thin, but the red lines that they have on Europe and also on fiscal policy are kind of fairly unimpeachable.
So, Steve, where this government might go next, whether it's in the signals that you've talked about in the speech and decisions actually that Keir Starmer might make himself, and they might be policy changes that he will lead over the coming months, or potential new leaders on the way. What is at stake here?
Well, lots, really. I mean, in terms of what kind of, and it looks more and more likely that there is going to be some form of leadership contest, whether it's kind of now or 3 months down the line. It is, again, about, I think, what those leadership people could say is going to be fairly constrained because of the context of the bond market, but also because of the context that we're sitting in the wake of the war in Iran. We are substantively poorer because of the kind of energy shock, the price shock. How we deal with that is not the kind of message that's going to be popular in a leadership contest. There's also, again, going back to these ideas of what is the kind of fiscal stance of a new government going to be. Are they going to keep to the same fiscal rules? Are they going to keep to the kind of tax and spend policies, especially kind of not raising the kind of big revenue raisers like income tax and national insurance? If that's the case, does that kind of constitute a breach of the manifesto? And then there's going to be calls for a general election. You're already seeing that from certain reform politicians. And then there's a case of, does the bond market then have to seriously consider what is the actual kind of economic position, economic stance of a reform government, or a government that includes a lot of reform politicians? And we really do not have kind of any kind of clue of what kind of stance that would be.
So how do politicians go about dealing with that bond market that we so often talk about, Steve? The fact that there's investors all around the world lending money to governments, choosing which governments and which companies they lend money to, and demanding a certain interest rate. And we have seen in recent times that interest rate for the UK go up a little bit faster than it has for maybe some of the UK's peers around the world. So how do politicians take that into account? And to what extent should they be taking that into account?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question about the should they. There does feel like there's a kind of almost a democratic limitation in the fact that, like, how we behave is to a certain extent kind of dictated by, it's always dangerous to anthropomorphize the bond markets, but like financial actors. But that is the reality of the situation that we're in. And, we saw kind of some of this when this Labour government came in back in July 2024. There was a lot of signalling by Rachel Reeves beforehand about some of the changes that we were going to make to the fiscal rules, the changing of the definition of debt. And you actually saw, there's a story in the Times today about Louise Haigh, who's quite influential on the kind of soft left of the Labour Party, talking about changes to the fiscal rules, but not necessarily immediately. It's basically kind of like a slow burn movement towards a different definition of debt, which doesn't seem overly kind of radical and does appear to acknowledge the realities of the market as it is today. But there is, there's a concern that the headlines are kind of calling for different definitions of debt, that kind of nuance might get lost.
So, Steve, do you see, as not only looking at politics as you do, but looking at economics as well, though the decisions we're making as a nation and where we focus our spend, are they very much going in certain directions. We're going to be talking about holidays a little bit later, and we often hear from that industry how that has become a bit of a non-negotiable for many households where they can make that work. Childcare, another one, as Rachel's talking about there. Are there certain sectors that are getting most of our money?
I think the picture is, as Rachel says, quite mixed, and it has been kind of even more mixed by the kind of big shock that came along, two months ago. Now, there was kind of signals at the beginning of the year of some kind of claim that the government could make that those kind of fabled green shoots of recovery and kind of consumer confidence were coming away. But at the same time, we have seen maybe a move away from some of that kind of discretionary spending in kind of sectors that aren't seen as most essential over time. And I think we'll probably see more and more of that kind of protective behaviour from consumers going forward.
Steve, good to have you on the show this morning. Thank you for your time. Dr. Steve Nolan, Senior Lecturer in Economics